Hello and welcome to another short mini lecture for your economics course. This particular lecture is going to cover the Keynesian economic perspective for fiscal policy, as well as touch on classical economics, and lastly talk about the Phillips curve and what that means. So this particular lecture is not going to be one where I graph and go through formulas. Instead, it's going to be more conceptual in nature as far as just understanding what the terms are and how fiscal policy works, per se, and the idea of trying to grow the economy in the short run. But before we get to that, let's quickly just define a few terms. So in the book, you're going to learn about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Anytime you hear the word aggregate before any economic term, that just means the entire nation or the entire representation of what you're talking about. So we were saying the aggregate demand for the United States, we'd be talking about the total demand or total spending on goods and services in the entire country. And aggregate supply just represents that business side, the producer side. And because it's aggregate, it means the entire output or entire production of businesses, firms, at each price, essentially. So the amount that's produced and the amount that's demanded by the entire country. That's aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So what happens whenever the economy is going down, or contracting, I should say, decreasing, GDP's decrease. What happens is aggregate demand and aggregate supply both shift left. We know that because that's the way demand and supply curves work. If you have less money to spend, your demand is going to shift left. It's going to shift inward. Same thing with the supply curves, is you're going to see a shift leftward or inward as production actually reduces. Well, classical view, so we'll start off with classical view, is that immediately prices are going to adjust. So if people don't have the money to spend because they're unemployed, then prices will adjust to that level really quickly and the economy will essentially fix itself. Now, the problem is that doesn't always happen, and it can also lead to very severe downturns like we saw in the Great Depression era, where things were really bad and you actually had hyperinflation where businesses essentially raised prices really quickly because they were worried about not being able to pay their employees. And then what you had is this vicious cycle where, because consumption was decreasing, then people were losing their jobs because the businesses couldn't afford to pay them. And as they were losing their jobs, they stopped spending money, which meant GDP was decreasing more. Cyclical unemployment, that's the bad kind of it started increasing. And you had this vicious cycle where it just got worse and worse. Well, here's where Keynes comes into play. So John Keynes is a famous economist who was the first to say that government could play a role in these downturns of the economy, that instead of just letting the business cycle just fix itself and the economy fix itself, in the short run, prices don't adjust that quickly. And essentially, we should only focus on the short run because prices are not adjusting quickly. You can make up for that loss in demand for a period of time before prices do adjust. And the idea, he said, was that in the long run, it doesn't matter. The economy is going to be much worse off place. So just focus on that short run. So think of it like this, because that's a lot to throw at you real quickly. But just think about it this way. If everything shuts down during the pandemic and people are not spending as much money, unemployment's going up, they're not spending as much because unemployment is making them worry that they may lose their job as well, workers, I should say. Well, then what happens is disposable income is decreasing. So people are not spending as much money. Firms and businesses then have to either figure out a way to pay for their employees, raise that price, or maybe lower it, right? Or in turn, they just lay off their employees, which as more employees lose their job during the pandemic, then you saw consumption go further. That's a vicious cycle. So here's where stimulus can come into play. Government sends out checks. That stimulus, that money gets spent. Essentially, a term that we'll learn here in a little while, marginal propensity to consume, that likelihood that you're going to spend that extra dollar, if it's high enough, you're going to go out and spend more money and keep the economy going, at least in the short run. And it's better to spend extra money from the government standpoint. Remember, GDP is Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX. Government standpoint in the short run, so that consumption doesn't fall too fast. Now, the problem that you can run into is that could lead to extra inflation and not actually help. The way I like to look at it is essentially thinking of it in terms of like antibiotics that you might take from a doctor. And when you're not feeling good, you have some kind of viral infection. Maybe it's bacteria. There we go. Bacteria infection, bacteria-related infection. You take antibiotics to treat that, right? And if you take antibiotics all the time, what will happen is you build up a resistance. And that's kind of what we've seen time and time again when the economy is going down. What happens is we tend to do a ton of stimulus, or maybe not enough. And when we finally do have enough, we tend to just leave the programs in place for longer than we need to, and we get used to it to where we need more and more the next time. That was kind of a side note, a little soapbox. Stick on to the topic. So the idea behind the Keynesian perspective is that in the short run, you can create what's called a wealth effect, make it feel like people have more money by getting that stimulus out there. And even though people are losing their jobs and the economy's headed in the wrong direction, in the short run, you're going to have this multiplier effect where I have more money because I have this wealth effect from expected future income, essentially. By doing that, you will keep the economy back on track and essentially smooth it out and make it to where we won't have as many severe downturns in the economy. All that to be said, so let's talk lastly about the Phillips curve. So when you're looking at fiscal policy isn't from the government standpoint. The Phillips curve deals with inflation, and Phillips was a famous economist who talked about that if you have too much spending, what can happen is you can have an inflation effect. And what happens is this shock to the system, people have way more money than what they've had before, the disposable income has gone up, then you're going to have more inflation. And what happens is that this in turn leads to higher unemployment. And so there's a trade-off between the two, that if you have lower inflation, then you're going to have less unemployment, and vice versa. And so that's the Phillips curve, essentially. The idea is that you got to balance the two. Government spending at a certain point can lead to inflation, so you got to be careful. Now, in the long run, it can really lead to a lot of hyperinflation. In the short run, your main concern is just combating the actual downturn. And so there's a balance between the two, and economists don't always agree. One thing, though, is for certain. You can't go to the complete classical view of saying, don't have any government spending and just don't have any involvement at all. And I know that seems like a good way to think of it because the government doesn't always do things efficiently. But if you have no government spending whatsoever, let's just say none at all, you wouldn't have things like the military to protect yourself, and you would also have severe depressions when the economy wasn't very good. And yes, the economy might grow at an exponential rate when it is going in the right direction, but the downturns would be so bad that it probably would way more than offset it. So the classical view doesn't really work. Now, the view that government should just spend and spend and spend to stimulate the economy also doesn't really make sense, because that would look more like a country where you have Honduras or others where you're just printing money, where your money supply is so high, you have really high inflation. That's a Phillips curve, which leads to higher rates of unemployment, because I can't essentially afford as much as I could before. So it's kind of a balance. We do know that Keynes was right, but to the extent of how much government spending should we have, and should we limit probably to just the downturns of stimulating the economy, economists don't always agree on that. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Hopefully it cleared up some things for you of how fiscal policy works. Lastly, before I sign off, I should say this is what fiscal policy would look like when politics agree, because Congress, and you're going to learn later on how budgets work, is in charge of fiscal policy. And we've seen that our politicians don't agree on anything or get along or do anything efficiently. Theoretically, it should work well, but reality, fiscal policy doesn't really happen very often because our politicians just don't seem to work. All right, off a soapbox. Hopefully you enjoyed this particular lecture, or thank you. Have a nice day. Go Broncos.